In the darkest days of the year 1945, when Europe lay in ruins and the world held its breath, various plans were secretly being formed that would change the course of history. It was about the division of one of the largest states in Europe to date. Germany, which was responsible for 2 brutal world wars, was to be carved up for all time. However, the Allies were highly divided on how such a division should look. Several different proposals were put forward, all of which would have steered the fate of Germany and Europe in a different direction. We have already looked at one of the most radical plans, the Morgenthau Plan, in a separate video. But Winston Churchill, the iron-fisted British Prime Minister, also had his very own plan for a future Germany. According to him, this is what Germany would have looked like after the war. What is quite exciting is that Germany would hardly have lost any territory in this scenario. On the contrary, it would even have grown. So what is this incredible proposal all about? How would it have changed Germany's fate, and why was it ultimately rejected? We take a look at all these fascinating questions in today's video. The year is 1943. The Allies had reached the turning point in the Second World War. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union had not only won the most important battle of Stalingrad, but also the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. This not only halted the German advance, but the Red Army also pushed the Germans further and further back to the west. In the Mediterranean, the Axis powers were not only driven out of the whole of North Africa, but with the landing in Sicily and later the rest of Italy, not only was Germany's most important ally defeated, but the Italians could even be persuaded to switch sides to the Allied camp. Victory over Germany no longer seemed too far-fetched, which is why the Allies met for the first time at the end of the year 1943 for a major conference, the so-called Tehran Conference. And so the 3 leaders of the Allies, namely Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, met for the first time in Iran. While initially the main topic of discussion was further war plans, such as the opening of a second front with the help of the Normandy landings, the fate of Europe after the end of the war was then discussed in detail. On the one hand, it was decided to move Poland to the west, but on the other hand, the division and occupation of Germany was also agreed. The British Prime Minister in particular had already prepared a detailed plan for this. However, this plan differed from other proposals, which simply envisaged the maximum possible punishment for Germany. For he realized that it was incredibly important to create a post-war order that would not only avoid the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles, but also prevent another catastrophe. Churchill, steeped in historical consciousness and guided by a vision of lasting security, feared a resurgence of German power that could once again jeopardize peace in Europe. This plan was also a reflection of the geopolitical reality of the time, characterized by the struggle between the great powers and the incipient rivalry between the West and the Soviet Union, which would soon usher in the Cold War. And so Churchill's ideas about post-war Germany were not only guided by sanctions and punishments, but also by the desire to prevent history from repeating itself. The plan was not only intended to weaken Germany, but also to create a balance in order to reorganize the distribution of power in Europe. But let's look at the plan in detail. First of all, the most important point is the division of Germany into 2 states and an internationally administered zone. The North German state would encompass the entire region north of Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg and would also retain most of Pomerania and Silesia. This was, of course, in direct contradiction to the Soviet Union's demand for Poland to be moved west. However, Germany would grow incredibly, especially in the south. The southern German state, also known as Danubia or Churchill Germany, would encompass all of southern Germany, i.e. Bavaria and Baden and Württemberg, but also all of Austria, Hungary and even the Carpathian Ukraine in the Far East. This meant that not only the German-speaking areas in the south would be united, but that Austria-Hungary would also be largely restored. However, the plan also included other points. These included, above all, the decentralization of power. By creating smaller, autonomous units, the intention was to decentralize power and thus prevent any future threat from a centralized German government. Then there was industrial dismantling in both states. Industry was to be dismantled or at least severely restricted in certain areas, particularly in the Ruhr region, the industrial heart of Germany, in order to minimize the country's military capacity. To achieve this, an international zone was to be set up there, as had already been implemented after the First World War. But let's take another look at the map. Why did Churchill want to expand southern Germany in particular so generously? This was in stark contrast to the generally demanded division of Germany. In fact, Churchill was already acting with sufficient foresight and identified the Soviet Union as the greatest future opponent, which he wanted to weaken as much as possible after the war. He was very concerned about a Soviet advance into Central Europe. And so, by linking Hungary and Austria to the southern part of Germany, he envisioned a state that was large and Western enough to limit Stalin's influence on Central Europe. Something similar was also to be achieved by enlarging the North German state. He thus achieved two goals at the same time. On the one hand, the division of Germany into two parts and the cession of the Ruhr region limited its power in the long term. On the other hand, both states were to serve as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. In addition, the two states were not to be punished as severely as after the First World War with the Treaty of Versailles. This was intended to prevent thoughts of revision, but also to create two Western and economically strong countries on the front line of the Iron Curtain. But what looked like a good plan to Churchill was firmly rejected by the other two Allied powers. Stalin made it clear that he would never accept the incorporation of Hungary into a new Germany. In addition, Poland, Czechoslovakia and Hungary were to form an empire of independent anti-Nazi, pro-Soviet states. Roosevelt also clearly rejected the plan. He feared that the Soviet Union would quickly gain too much influence over one of the two German states and pull it into the Soviet bloc. This was similar to what happened in reality, except that the Iron Curtain would have run from west to east between the two German states. In addition, the other allies, such as France, were naturally highly dissatisfied with the fact that Germany was hardly to be punished territorially and, on the contrary, the southern German state was even to gain numerous Eastern European territories. And so Churchill's plan was doomed to failure. At the subsequent conferences in Yalta and Potsdam, it was finally decided to divide Germany and Austria into 4 occupation zones. However, many of Churchill's ideas were also incorporated into this. Here too, Germany was to be quickly rebuilt to serve as a bastion against the Soviet Union. Churchill was so paranoid that he was still expecting a major war with the Soviet Union in the year 1945, which is why he had the war plan Operation Unthinkable drawn up in May. In it, a large-scale preemptive strike against the Soviet Union was to take place as early as the 1st of July in the year 1945 in order to establish an East Germany and Poland independent of the Soviet Union. However, the new U.S. President Truman generally rejected any idea of a military confrontation with the Red Army at this time. In addition, the Soviet Union was clearly outnumbered and the British soldiers simply wanted to go home after the horrors of years of war. And so the top-secret plan disappeared into a drawer. It was only made public in the year 1998. Feel free to write in the comments if you would like to see a detailed video about it. So, to summarize, we could say that Churchill's original partition plan had some good points. If it had been implemented at the time, we would certainly be living in a different Europe today. Perhaps two different German states really would have developed in parallel and there would never have been reunification. However, the extent to which the southern German state in particular would have lasted is highly questionable. While southern Germany and Austria are relatively close culturally, the same cannot really be said of the Hungarian and Ukrainian territories. The different languages alone would have caused numerous problems. And the Soviet Union would certainly have exerted its influence right from the start and had a major impact on the development of both states. How do you think Germany would have developed under this plan? Feel free to write it in the comments.